Hello, happy St. Patrick's Day, and welcome to a St. Patrick's Day edition of the House of Bronte. When we're going to look at a man who was born on this day and was named after the patron saint. It's Patrick Bronte. Patrick Bronte was born on 17th of March, St. Patrick's Day as we know it today, 17th of March 1777. And it was an auspicious day because he was born in Ireland. Now, Ireland at the time was one island, which part of the United Kingdom. So we didn't have Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland. But he was born in a place called Drumballyrooney, near Emdale, in what is now County Down in Northern Ireland. But then it was County Down in Ireland. So he was an Irish man, born on St. Patrick's Day. So of course his parents Hugh and Alice named him Patrick. He became Patrick Bronte, but he wasn't called Patrick Bronte at the time. Now at the time the family were called either Prunty or Brunty or O'Prunty. It's different spellings of their name, as very often was in the late 18th century. And his name changed later. We'll look briefly at when his name changed. But his life changed as well. That's why, in a nutshell, his name changed. So Patrick was born to a not at all wealthy family, to a farming family, a small holding that his father had in County Down. Patrick could have been expected to continue that family line. It was a Protestant family, but still quite a large family. He would have been expected maybe to take over the farm eventually, or to work on the farm, or to become a weaver, which was a common profession in that area. So as a teenager, he was training to become a weaver. It was at a weaver's cottage, having a break, and he was sat outside reading. He loved to read. He obviously had some schooling. He'd learnt himself a lot more. He'd read a lot of books. So even though he's from a poor background with no formal schooling, he taught himself quite well because he was reading Paradise Lost by John Milton. And he was sat outside the weaver's cottage where he was learning, reading his book, Paradise Lost, and a local vicar went past and heard him reading, was very impressed. And from that moment, he took an interest in the young Patrick Bronte and enrolled him at the local parish school. So he got some formal schooling, and very shortly, Patrick's talents stood out, and he was actually made a teacher. While he was still a teenager, he became a teacher at the school. And eventually, another parish priest in the area, Thomas Tighe, made Patrick the headmaster of a school in the area while he was still a teenager again. And he taught Thomas Tighe's own children. So Patrick obviously had great talents from a young age when it came to education, educating himself and educating other people. And that's what changed his story, really. Because, he could have expected to carry on being a subsistence farmer, but Tighe saw a talent in him, not just for teaching, but for the church. Patrick was a deeply religious young man as well, and Tighe realised that Patrick had it in him to become a Church of England Protestant minister. But there was only one way you could do that in those days. You had to go to university, either to an Irish university, to the Irish University, or to one of the two English universities, Oxford or Cambridge. Tighe had been a student at Cambridge University, and he arranged for Patrick Bronte in his 20s to go across to Cambridge and get a scholarship, in effect, at Cambridge University. He was what they called a sizar, Sizar. That means he got help with his fees. So he was among some very exalted fellow students, including Palmerston, who became Foreign Secretary, and Prime Minister William Palmerston. William Wilberforce was a fellow student there as well. There's some really big names. But Patrick Bronte as he still was then, when he came to register at St John's College, Cambridge, very grand, beautiful college, very different to what he'd known in County Down. The registrar registered his name wrong. He'd put Patrick Bronte, he crossed it out, and a couple of days later he changed it to Patrick Bronte. So had he misheard Patrick's name, or had Patrick told him a different name? I think he probably told him Bronte because he wanted to change his identity to be less obviously Irish. And also he was a big fan of Horatio Nelson, Lord Nelson, who'd recently been named Duke of Bronte, which was a Sicilian dukedom. So it's a tribute to, I think, to Nelson, the Duke of Bronte, and also Patrick was very well studied in Latin and Greek, even at this age, and he knew that Bronte in Greek meant thunder. So he was thundering into new life with a great new name. But it was his children who would make that name famous, of course. So Patrick married Maria Branwell. He had 6 children, 6 incredible children, of course, but 3 of them especially have made his name famous throughout history, throughout the world. His 3 youngest daughters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne Bronte. Now, Patrick had really to raise his daughters a lot himself. His wife died when Anne Bronte was just a 1-year-old baby, tragically. We'll look at that in another episode. Now his wife, Maria's sister, older sister Elizabeth Branwell, came to Haworth and really became a second mother to the Bronte children. We'll look at that as well. Elizabeth Branwell, Aunt Branwell as they called her, did a lot to help the Bronte children. But Patrick was the one parent, really, which endured throughout their lives, and he tragically outlived all his 6 children as well as his wife. So Patrick had a huge influence on the Brontes, and I think it was a huge influence for the good, because Patrick had some very modern, very progressive views, we'd say, for the early 19th century. Now at the time, women, girls, were expected to do housework, expected to become governesses, and indeed that's what the Brontes were trained up for. So they weren't given the same education as boys, and books were largely kept away from girls and from young women. Patrick Bronte didn't believe this at all. He believed fully in the power of education. Every parish he went to, he set up church schools. There's one next to Haworth Parsonage in Haworth, which is still there today, that Patrick founded, and at which Charlotte, Branwell, Emily, and Anne Bronte all taught, because Patrick loved the power of education to change lives. It changed his life completely, and he became a respectable middle-class member of the community. It was never particularly well paid, but it was much better than he could have expected as a farmer in County Down. Changed his life, changed his children's lives, and he believed it could do the same for other people who'd be born into less than auspicious backgrounds. But he didn't just believe in that for boys, he believed in it for girls as well. He was a firm believer in girls being allowed to express themselves, being allowed to learn, being allowed to read. Patrick had a big library, and Branwell loved books and magazines as well. And the children, girls and the boy Branwell, were all allowed to read whatever they wanted. We know from Charlotte Bronte's letters she read Byron, she read Shelley, and they would have been very controversial choices for young women and for girls to read at that time. But Patrick Bronte said, let them read, let them expand their minds, let them make their own minds up. And it was that creativity that led to their amazing writing, their amazing novels a few years later. So we have a lot to be thankful to Patrick Bronte for. He was an eccentric man, he admitted that himself. And he said, if I admit, he said, I'm a rather eccentric individual, but if I hadn't been so, I would never have had children like mine. And I think that's probably true, because they were a remarkable family indeed. Now, Patrick went on to be curate at Haworth for 40 years, just over 40 years, long-standing curate there, well into his old age. When he was practically blind, he was still leading services, but doing it by memory, doing marriage ceremonies by rote, by memory. So he's an incredible curate, really, and people in Haworth loved him. Even those who didn't go to official Church of England services, he was still very, very popular. So I'd like to close our St. Patrick's Day tribute to Patrick Bronte by reading from a recollection of somebody who saw Patrick Bronte in 1857. It was 2 years after Charlotte Bronte's death. Patrick's in old age, but he's still preaching in Haworth, and it's reported in the Bradford Observer on the 19th of November 1857. A Day at Haworth, it's called, by JWF. He didn't give his name. He gave his friend's name who came with him to Haworth as Puzzlecraft, which is a bit of an unusual name. Maybe he's using pseudonyms for some reason. But JWF and Puzzlecraft took a train, walked to Keighley, walked 5 miles from Keighley to Haworth, which they explain in their article. So I'm just going to read from that now. So JWF explained, as we walked slowly up the street, as a big cobbled, steep main street, as it's called now, in Haworth. So as we walked slowly up the street, we lighted upon a chemist's shop. The old apothecary is still there, of course. It's now called Cabinet of Curiosities. Brilliant shop if you get the chance to visit that. We lighted upon a chemist's shop with a frame of photographic portraits hung outside. In the centre was a likeness of an elderly gentleman with white hair, strongly marked but expressive features, and a peculiarly large neckcloth. "Mr. Bronte," we both exclaimed in a breath, although we'd neither of us ever seen the gentleman or his portrait. There was such striking individuality upon the countenance, but we recognised at once the original, so plainly painted by Mrs. Gaskell. That's in Gaskell's biography of Charlotte Brontë a couple of years earlier. We put up at the White Lion, which is still there in Haworth, a great place to visit, great food there, and ordered dinner. Mine host, whose outer man, attired in a cap and a white shooting jacket, was eminently suggestive of terrier dogs, went off forthwith to the parsonage to summon his maidservant, who'd gone to wait upon the rector during the temporary absence of the regular domestic. Presently she came down, and in an unsophisticated Yorkshire fashion, as if anything she had to say was not of the slightest importance, she gave us her few particulars respecting the Bronte family. Her family had lived at the parsonage for long. She had often been there herself, had seen Mrs. Nichols, Charlotte Bronte's married name. She had seen Mrs. Nichols writing a great deal. It was when she was writing Jane Eyre. Had oft carried little parcels, large parcels, to the post, and wondered what was in them. Mrs. Nichols, Charlotte, Mrs. Nichols was very small. Miss Emily was bigger a good deal. They were all great walkers, used to go up onto the moor for hours together. She had seen Mrs. Gaskell, but didn't know much about her. Mrs. Nichols had never got the better of a cold she caught going one winter's day onto the moor to the waterfall. Cascade, Mrs. Gaskell called it. We asked her if she thought Mr. Bronte would be annoyed if we called upon him. She didn't know. There had been lots of people there, but he didn't often see any of them. We requested of her to take our cards up to the parsonage and to say that if Mr. Bronte was disengaged, there were 2 gentlemen who would be happy to wait upon him. And while she delivered the message, we went up to view the house and churchyard, round which cluster now so many mournful and hallowed associations. Returning to our inn, we received Mr. Bronte's invitation to visit him, with which we immediately complied. We were ushered into a small front parlour and very cordially saluted by the original of a photograph we had seen in the chemist's shop. Truly a most noticeable man is Mr. Bronte, and worthy to be the father of such a family. Though now well up in years, he told us his age, but it's escaped our memory. He appears quite hale and fresh, and preaches regularly every Sunday morning. He has a grand face, indicative of a power and energy which are merely mellowed by time, and shaded somewhat mournfully by suffering. One glance at that physiognomy assures you that its possessor has been shaped by nature after a model of his own. A man of strong passions, but stronger self-control, of warm emotions, but adamantine will, a man possibly eccentric, but whose eccentricities merely prove the positive tendency of his being and the strength and struggles of his soul. This we must say, that we never saw a finer physique, more courteous and gentlemanly bearing, and more sincere and correct feeling than we met in Mr. Bronte. Mournful was it to see the venerable man, to know that all his children, the gifted, the admired, the affectionate, not one was left. After sitting about a quarter of an hour with Mr. Bronte, we took a 5-minute run onto the moor. So that was the encounter with Patrick Bronte, by then in advanced age. All his children are gone. But he's still welcoming visitors and he's still much loved. And he himself has become so celebrated by 1857 that the local chemist shop is selling photographs of him. And there's still some examples of his photographs that he'd signed, still around in the Bronte Parsonage Museum. So enjoy St. Patrick's Day, whether that means you're going to have a jig later. I do a little river dance here, but I don't want to embarrass any of the non-professional dancers out there. So if you want a whiskey or a Guinness, go ahead, but just celebrate all things Irish. And remember Patrick Bronte, remember Bronte's Irish roots. And I hope you can join me again for another episode of The House of Bronte. Thank you.